Okay, let's start with a thought experiment. Imagine you're a prisoner of war. The fighting's over. All you can think about is freedom, right? Going home. But what if home was actually more terrifying than the prison camp you're in? What if you found yourself fighting, scheming, doing everything in your power, not to escape, but to stay locked up? It sounds completely backwards, but this is a real and mostly forgotten story from the end of World War II, and it all kicks off with one man on his hands and knees crawling under a fence.
So, picture this. It's September 22nd, 1945. The war in Europe has been over for months. A 24-year-old German sergeant, George Gartner, is sneaking out of a POW camp in New Mexico. But here's the twist. He wasn't running from his American captors. In fact, he kind of liked them. No, he was running from something else entirely. He was running from the very idea of going home. And this quote, it just perfectly captures the whole crazy situation. See, Gartner's home, a region called Silesia, wasn't technically Germany anymore. The Allied leaders had redrawn the maps, and his town was now under Polish and, more importantly, Soviet control. For him, being repatriated didn't mean a happy reunion. It meant being handed over to the Soviets, which was basically a death sentence, either a quick one or a slow one in a Siberian labor camp. So his escape, it wasn't about getting away. It was about running towards a future he could actually live in. Now, here's where it gets really interesting. George Gartner wasn't some isolated case, not even close. He was just one of literally thousands of German soldiers who looked at their options and decided that life as a fugitive in America was a better bet than being a free man back in their old homeland. And that begs a huge question, one that we're going to dive into. What does it really mean when the soldiers you just defeated would rather stay in your prison camps than go back to the country they fought for? So, Gartner's story is our entry point into a much, much bigger dilemma. A dilemma that was facing hundreds of thousands of his fellow soldiers. For these men, the end of the war wasn't a celebration. It was the beginning of a truly impossible choice.
First, let's just get our heads around the sheer scale of this. We're not talking about a handful of guys. We're talking about over 370,000 German POWs. That's a population bigger than the city of Pittsburgh, spread out in over 500 camps all across America. And for a massive chunk of them, the news that the war was over wasn't good news at all. It was the start of a whole new kind of nightmare.
And the source of that nightmare? Well, it was a piece of paper, the Potsdam Agreement. Basically, Truman, Stalin, and Churchill got together and literally redrew the map of Europe. In doing so, they carved off huge chunks of Eastern Germany and handed them over to Poland and the Soviet Union. Just like that, for about 123,000 of these prisoners, home was no longer in Germany. Their towns, their farms, their families, they were now under the thumb of the one power they feared most, the Soviets. So let's break down the terrible math these guys were doing in their heads. Option A, go home. That meant Soviet occupation, rations that were literally set at starvation levels, around 1,000 calories a day, and a very real chance of being shipped to a work camp or just outright executed. Option B, stay in America. Yeah, you're still a prisoner or you're a fugitive on the run. It's a huge risk, but you're in a prosperous country, and at least you have a chance. When you look at it like that, the choice becomes terrifyingly clear, doesn't it? And look, their fear wasn't just paranoia. It was based on something they had seen with their own two eyes. It was a horrifying operation called Keelhaul. Through the barbed wire of their own camps, these German POWs watched as Soviet prisoners, some of whom had been forced to fight for Germany, were violently rounded up by American soldiers. They were dragged kicking and screaming to trains that would take them back to face Stalin. Some of these men literally killed themselves on the spot rather than get on those trains. Can you imagine witnessing that? It was a terrifying preview of what they believed was coming for them. So, faced with this grim future, the prisoners didn't just sit there and wait for the worst. Oh no, they got organized. They started to resist. They used every tool at their disposal to try and stay in the one place that felt remotely safe, which, ironically, it was inside an American prison camp. And their resistance took on all kinds of forms. You had everything from organized, passive stuff like mass hunger strikes to outright escape attempts. They filed legal challenges. Tragically, some took their own lives. And it got even darker. They sometimes murdered their own men, anyone they suspected of collaborating with the Americans and pushing for repatriation. The desperation was just off the charts. At one key processing center, Fort Eustis in Virginia, this resistance turned into an all-out campaign of chaos. See, the Americans had this democracy course to screen prisoners. If you were classified as black, meaning a hardcore Nazi, you were facing years of extra forced labor in Europe. So what did the prisoners do? They created an entire black market. They sold white or anti-Nazi classifications for a few packs of cigarettes. They destroyed their ID papers. They even faked huge outbreaks of illness to completely overwhelm the camp's hospital. It was a systematic effort to break the system. But maybe the most legendary act of resistance was the Great Papago Escape. I mean, this is straight out of a Hollywood movie. These guys dug a tunnel that was 178 feet long. That's over half a football field. They had to get rid of 30 tons of dirt, so they cleverly disguised it by building a new volleyball court. Then, during a Christmas party they staged, 25 officers just slipped out into the Arizona night. The planning was absolutely brilliant.
But here comes the reality check. For all that brilliant planning, escaping the camp was one thing. Surviving in the vast American landscape was another. The result was almost comical. Many were caught pretty quickly. A few of them were found just sitting in a park in Phoenix, completely dejected. Turns out their grand plan to build a raft and float to Mexico hit a tiny snag. The rivers they saw on their maps were, in reality, bone-dry desert washes.
So while all this drama is going down inside the camps, a totally different fight was heating up on the outside, because it turned out that a lot of Americans didn't actually want the POWs to leave. Farmers and businesses had grown incredibly dependent on their labor, and this created a massive conflict right in the heart of the American economy. Just look at these numbers. They're insane. These German prisoners picked almost 1 billion pounds of vegetables, over 500 million pounds of fruit. We're talking 14 million man-days of labor. With so many American men overseas, these POWs became the backbone of the agricultural workforce. They literally saved harvests and made a lot of money for the U.S. government, which was paid directly for their labor. So you end up with this really fascinating political battle. On one side, you have entire states, powerful farming groups, and big companies all screaming to keep the POWs. They were a cheap, reliable source of labor. But on the other side, you have the powerful labor unions and veterans groups. They were outraged. They called it a betrayal, using former enemy soldiers for cheap labor while American GIs were coming home and struggling to find jobs. It was a huge political firestorm. Now, despite the official U.S. policy, which was to send every single prisoner back, that's not where the story ends. Because the desperate fight these men waged to stay in America left a deep, lasting mark, not just on their own lives, but on the entire nation. Let's go back to our guy, George Gardner, the man who started it all. His story is just incredible. He managed to live as a fugitive under the name Dennis Wilds for 40 years. He built a whole new life. He became a ski instructor, an architect. He got married to an American woman, had a family, all while hiding this massive secret. He finally revealed himself in 1985 on national television. And in the most amazing final chapter, at 88 years old, George Gardner officially became a U.S. citizen. He finally got what he risked it all for. And that dream of an American life wasn't just Gardner's. After being forcibly sent back to Germany, an estimated 5,000 of his fellow ex-POWs did something remarkable. They legally immigrated back to the United States. They'd had a taste of a different world, and they spent years navigating the bureaucracy to make that world their permanent home. And the ripple effects of this whole episode are just huge. Think about it. This whole crisis helped shape America's future policies on accepting refugees, especially those fleeing communism during the Cold War. On a more personal level, about 1,200 prisoners ended up marrying American women. But maybe the biggest impact was from a secret American re-education program. It basically trained a new generation of democratic German leaders inside the camps. These guys went on to become giants of post-war Germany, helping build the democratic nation and even the European Union as we know it today. So, we end up right back where we started, with this stunning paradox. This whole strange, forgotten piece of history forces you to ask a really deep question. What does it say about a country when the enemies you just fought a brutal war against see more hope, more opportunity, more freedom inside your prison fences than they do in their own homes? It suggests that maybe, sometimes, the idea of a place can be more powerful than any flag or ideology. That sometimes freedom isn't about where you're from. It's about having the chance to build a life, wherever you can find it.